Literal translation. Newmark said that literal translation, or called straight translation or linear translation, is between word-for-word translation and free translation. In the process of translation, translators look for the grammatical construction of the source text that are similar or close to the target text grammatical patterns. This method is first carried out like word-for-word translation, but the translator then adjusted the arrangement of his words according to the grammar of the target language. For the example, from the source language, "Hi smart boy, you have done a perfect job." To the target language, "Hai anak cerdas, kamu telah berhasil mengerjakan sebuah pekerjaan yang sempurna." The phrase "smart boy" has been translated according to the Indonesian phrase structure into "anak cerdas." And the sentence "you have done a perfect job" has been translated into "kamu telah berhasil mengerjakan sebuah pekerjaan yang sempurna." It's quite well and acceptably. And the next is variety of close translation. The first is word-for-word translation. Word-for-word translation transfer such language grammar and word order as well as the primary meanings of all the such language words into the translation. For the example, "he works in the house now." The second is one-to-one translation. Each source language word has a corresponding target language word, but their primary meanings may differ. For the example is take an exam. Literal translation ranges from one word to one word through group to group. For the example is a beautiful garden. The next is collocation to collocation, and the example is make a speech. The next is close to close. For the example, when that was done. And the last is two sentence to sentence. For the example, the man was in the street. The translation of Putri. The translation of Putri is the fifth word most emphasis is normally put on the creation of a new independent form, and word literal translation is usually condemned. In translating a poem, one of the literary genre, the translators are also likely to face similar problems. The first step to deal with this problem is to find the deep structure. Find the logical subject first, then specific verb. After that, the translator can reconstruct the structure in the target language as closely as possible to the original structure. Faithful and false friend. The translation of objects and movements is usually more literal than that of qualities and ways of moving. We must not be afraid of literal translation or, in particular, of using a target language word which looks the same or nearly the same as the source language word. And again, the more general and abstract word may or may not be translated transparently. There is often a shift at the abstract level, but the translation is still usually one-to-one.
Hello, I'm Zara Zahtira Prananda. I want to continue next slide. Elegant variation. Elegant variation on literal and poetry are common because of translators need to use a word which fits the scansion and rhyme patterns of the phrase or sentence. Example: Bendix of Mayfair have established a reputation respected throughout the world for the manufacture of chocolate. Confectionery of the eggs qualify, and the change into Perancis language, like in the slides. The translation is lexically and grammatically literal, but for confectionery, which has to be changed and is satisfactorily conflated with manufacture, and the two unnecessary elegant variation. Next slide. Back Translation Test or BTT. A source language word should not to be translated into a target language word which has another obvious one-to-one equivalent in the source language. And back translation involves the translation of a text which itself is a translation back into the original language, like English source to impair, Spanish translation affectar, and English back translation to affect. The meaning of the term in the back translation does equal the meaning of the original source. Next slide. Accepted translation. Some transparent institutional terms are translated in at least Western European language, even though the target language or TL cultural equivalent widely with a different function. Example: president, senate, prefect, chancellor, and mayor. Thank you.
Constraints on literal translation. In translating short language, does not must always be translated one-to-one or literally with the equivalent target language. Constraint on literal translation is happen if a precisely natural short language unit produces a clumsy literal translation. Example: short language. Itna parvenait pas a digger de say surprise. And the target language is he wasn't succeeding in freeing himself from his surprise. If this translation is wrong, the result of this translation will make people confused about the meaning of the translation. The correct translation result is he couldn't overcome with surprise. And the next natural translation. We know that there are kinds of insidious resistances to literal translation. We make it like it is not translation. It is mechanical or the translation produced from Google Translate, for example. It is not clever for using translation in doing transmission. What we make find an acceptable literal translation of an ordinary language unit is that you find a natural, a heure as venue or less mission basis. If you insist, you would not normally say, the hour has come. Only the time has come. Recreative translation. A bad translator will always do his best to avoid translating word for word. Recreative translation is the revisit translation by interpreting meanings, not words as the translator last searched. An important research, certainly a touchstone of his linguistic sensitivity and creativity. His vigilance and intelligence when words are misleading. Literary translation. Literary translation is the translation of creative and dramatic prose and poetry into other languages. Modern literary translators react to rigid literary style, should continually pursue what is to them more natural, more colloquial, easier, and more relaxed than the original.
The subtext. Michael Mayer has matched much of the concept of the subtext, what is implied but not said, the meaning behind the meaning. To an intelligent reader, the true meaning behind the meaning is clear, and the translator must word the sentence in such a way that the subtext is equally clear in English. The concept of the subtext is a useful variant term for the function or the intention of a text, the thin thread which the translator has to pursue throughout his work. But the concept is dangerous and misleading if the subtext starts to obtrude on the text. But differently, if the description or the surface text is partially or wholly replaced by the function, the deep structure of the text, the symbol by its meaning, and so on. The notion of the no equivalent word. The difficulties of literal translation are often highlighted not so much by linguistic or referential context as by the context of a cultural tradition. To write off as untranslatable a word whose meaning cannot be rendered literally and precisely by another word is absurd, particularly when it could at least be better delineated by componential analysis into 4 or 5 words, though as a footnote not in the text of the play. The role of context. In translation, the translator indeed has to be aware of all the varieties of context, so many it is idle to list them again, but this doesn't mean that context is the overriding factor in all translation and has primacy over any rule, theory, or primary meaning. Where a writer deliberately innovates, the translator has to follow him. A good literal translation must be effective in its own right. The less context bound the words, the more likely a literal translation will. The more standard are the colloquialism, idiom, stock metaphors, the less likely is a literal translation. Inevitably, there is a proper place for literal translation as a procedure in all good translation.